All right. I feel like I mean, this isn't the thickest of the ones that we've had, but I feel like it would have been appropriate to put this book on the kitchen scale so that we just knew how many just grams of heavy information that we were going to deal with today. So here we are gathered here to have conversation about possessive investment in whiteness. And this is one of those books where it's like, well, which conversation are we going to have, right? Because this book went everywhere. And so today, because let's switch things up. I mean, I'm going to ask you guys all my regular questions because we are all people of habit, as this book argues. I shouldn't, that wasn't funny. Because habit is not what he was arguing about. He was arguing about structures. But I thought that there was that there's a quote on a quote that occurs in chapter 1 that could be a good launching off point to just sort of see where we go. And this quote is this: white power secures its dominance by seeming not to be anything in particular. And that resulted in a lot of nods of various like depths. And so I thought that might be a good place to start. Like that's the sentence. Well, actually, when I noticed that all of the quotes in the beginning were James Baldwin, I was like, all right, we're in for an adventure. But like that quote made me feel like, oh, okay, this book is going to do some work. So I'm just wondering what that quote made you guys feel or think as readers.
Yeah, what it represented for me is, or at least it echoed the difficulties that I've had in having conversations about white supremacy, about our possessive investment in whiteness, if I had a quarter for every time I've thought that phrase, are really difficult because the person goes, what are you talking about? I can't see that concretely in front of me. So what are you? But what it really reminded me of is I'm trying to find the dang quote from the very, very last chapter where the author talks about like, in order to keep white supremacy afloat, we have to lie about it, ignore it. And do you remember the part I'm talking about?
I know what you're talking about. I probably highlighted it.
Oh, geez Louise. But that's what, it's funny that quote from chapter 1 represented something from the last chapter that I was like, ooh, they put words to something that I've been thinking but haven't had the ability to put words to.
It's it's living with evil, accepting it, and learning to lie about it.
And that learning to lie about it, that allows this inability for people to say, what are you talking about? What do you mean white supremacy? You know?
I was doing a discussion group recently somewhere else, and it was about whiteness and white supremacy. And I asked the question, like, and it was all white people. And it was like, what are the narratives that we learn about like being white? And like, and we, you know, we were citing these things that we all learned from a very young age, even though we all knew that they were like not true. These are like very strong messages. So that white people are like normal. We're like white bread, milk toast, just plain vanilla. Like we can't dance, we can't jump. We're just like so completely normal and harmless. And it's amazing how this narrative just gets drilled into us from a very young age. And I think that like, it's certainly not all of what he's talking about in the book, but like there's a way in which white people are like really carefully trained to like see themselves as just like these harmless entities who are just like, I'm just a normal person over here. And like, and therefore like not really being able to see, it's like, oh, but actually like you have a lot of power.
Yeah, I was thinking it too, just from this book and the new Jim Crow both had similar feelings where a lot of the information, the content feels familiar in some way of like, there's discrimination, housing discrimination, like we kind of know about it in some way, but this book really put it in like at the forefront that like, but the discrimination is because of white supremacy. Whereas like that piece of it is just never talked about. It's like there's discrimination that just like happens for some reason. The criminal justice system, all the people in prison are just Black. That's just, and it's just like this book is like, it's because of white supremacy. And I feel like that is so rare to read and like have so explicitly pointed out. Just so like I was underlining like everything. I was just like, yes, like this is where, this is the book I was waiting for that would just like put it in such an explicit way. Like that discrimination doesn't just happen.
One of the things that stood out to me as I was reading this book, you know, as someone who reads a lot of history for fun, was the way that some of the touchstone things that you know about, the way that he was like, yeah, so this thing that you learned about as this big accomplishment, let me tell you a little bit about how toothless it was. And that was very interesting to think about. Like there are certain things like, for example, when he was talking about some of the legislation that happened with the New Deal, right? Like I remember sitting in lectures looking at, well, actually one of the executive orders. I remember sitting in a lecture learning about that executive order. I do not recall learning about its impotency, right? Or like when he dug into Plessy versus Ferguson, right? Which I remember reading a book that was specifically about Plessy versus Ferguson. And of course, this was several years ago, you know, but when he framed it, he was like, listen, like you all are taught, or you're thinking about Plessy versus Ferguson as if it's about the rights of Blackness. And it is not. It is about, you know, Mr. Plessy, who is 7/8 white, wanting his claim on his 7/8 of whiteness, right? And that's just not the way that we think about Plessy versus Ferguson. I mean, you know, it happened in Louisiana, you know, it was about the streetcar, and you know that that was one of the things that, like, the way that we talk about it, like codified segregation, which, like, when you look at this book, it's like, oh, well, there were a number of things codifying segregation. It was just interesting to look at these things that may already exist for many people as drawers to put information into. And he's like, you're gonna need to take that out of your dresser and examine what that is, because what you might think it is, what you probably think it is, or like how you've tagged it, maybe it needs some different tags or additional tags to what you're thinking about.
That part where the one Supreme Court justice who dissented, and everyone was like, what a cool guy, what an amazing guy in history. And then you read the thing and it's like, he's like, he literally says, like, I just want to start off by saying the white race is the superior race.
And will always be.
Yeah. But unfortunately, Black people are protected by the Constitution. And it's like, how did this man ever receive accolades? It's in the book, it's in the ruling, it's on paper, the words are there.
I think though, but that makes me think about like the way that the words that are always there work, right? Like you're reading some law that's about corn or something, and that's the law that's actually taking away your rights, right? Like there's always stuff that's like written into all the things. And we were thinking about that or hearing about that with the recent Recovery Act. Like what else is in there? You know, that's about like so many things, because that's how they do this stuff. They like get together and like put all of their stuff in there. And so like when you think about it that way, it's like, oh, right. That's how it works. You know, that's an official term. I don't know how it's spelled. I only know how to do it. So one of the thoughts, I wonder if you guys had this thought as you were reading this book. So I'm reading this book and I'm reading and I'm reading and I'm reading. And I'm like, man, I think that this book would be really hard for a lot of people to read. Like if they are super committed, like I think that this book would be hard for certain white people who are very committed to the idea of their own innocence to read. Like there were certain pieces where I read a thing, I was like, did he say this? And I just wonder if you guys had a similar experience at all reading that. And if so, like what are the sorts of things that made you have that, like, is he allowed to write this?
There was that particular part where he kept on repeating, like, he was using the names of all the mass killers in America. And they were like, he was like, oh, Dylan Roof, he wasn't an anomaly. And then it's the next guy, and it's like, he wasn't an anomaly either. And then the next guy, and it was that tone, it was that repetition. It was how he used language that really highlighted the point he was making. But I definitely got that feeling that you just described of like, oh, he's letting us have.
I didn't highlight any of these ones because they just tickled me, but like his use of language made my heart so happy. I mean, like you're reading all of this. I just love the way that he wrote this, right? Because like he's like, you will get all of the facts, but he's like, facts don't have to be boring. I'm gonna throw in this quick little
like
bit.
sprinkle it in there.
Yes, this was not an unseasoned bowl of whatever. He definitely.
Yeah, and he's funny too. There were parts I laughed out loud. I mean, it's like heartbreaking, but like there was humor in here too.
Well, there was a line about, it was at the very end of one of the chapters about like, I can't even remember like what it was specifically talking about, but he was like, oh, well, you know, there's nothing wrong with the color of white people's skin. It must be the content of their character. And I was like, burn! Oh my God.
Yeah, that was one where I was like, it's like the editors let this. I wonder how hard he had to fight to keep that in this book. I mean, and maybe he didn't because it is an academic, because it's fundamentally an academic text, right? And so like maybe that works a little bit differently, but that was definitely one that was like, yikes.
George Lipsitz had the time for Clarence Thomas as well. Like almost in every other chapter or so, he's like, by the way, like, I just want to remind you that I have time to tell you about Clarence Thomas. How does Clarence Thomas sleep after this book was written? Like, poor Clarence Thomas. It takes a lot for me to feel bad for Clarence Thomas, but reading this, I was like, this is bullying. This poor man. How does he even go to McDonald's? You know.
He doesn't go to McDonald's. He sends somebody else.
Yeah, that's it.
That's how he might not even sleep. He might just hire somebody else to do it for him. Who would you recommend this book to?
That's a good question because it's not for everyone. And I think I would recommend this book to other people who are just kind of there, like to white people who are just like there, who, okay, I learned about this history, I want to learn about how this works.
Yeah, I feel like you kind of already need to have a foot in the door for this book to land where it is. Because I'm thinking a lot about, you know, we all have like the racist family member who's like not going to read this book, or who will start this book and be like, nope, this is wrong. This is not my experience because I'm poor or because I'm whatever. Yeah.
I asked you guys that question because I asked myself that question. I was like, I don't know that I could recommend this book thinking that recommendation would result in somebody reading it. Like I just can't imagine in my civilian life, I cannot imagine the circumstance where I would make this recommendation and expect it to be anything but like body temperature, breath dissipating into the air.
What it reminded me of, what I wanted is, there's like this, I don't know if it's a recent phenomenon, but nonfiction adult books then having like a kids edition. Do you know what I'm talking about? And I was like, I wish I was reading the kids edition, not because I want it to be sterilized, but just because I want to understand it more plainly.
It's funny that you say that, because I feel like one of the things that like one of the things that that I will recommend to my son, I'm thinking about the older one here, like in college, is like if you are learning about something you don't know anything about, go get a kid's book and then like read it, because those people were forced to synthesize the topic. Read the kid's book first, and then you will have the reference points that you need in order to digest the material. And that's not something that that's not something that ever would have occurred to me. Like when I wish somebody had told me that as an undergraduate, because that would have made a lot of things a lot easier. And it wasn't until I was taking a children's literature class for my library degree and I had to read all of the stuff that I was like, these books are really just laying out the timeline and in a way that was like digestible and accessible. So spread that gospel. That's the recommendation to like to give to people.
We should just like email him and be like, hey, would you mind doing a children's version of this book?
So this book did have a lot of repetition in it because there were a lot of ideas that repeat themselves, right? So like I want to be careful in the way that I use the word repetition, because that's a word that sometimes we use in a negative sense, right? Like when we're talking about information, but that's not how I mean it. But like, were there places that where the repetition or the recurrence of themes or ideas or circumstances really stood out to you? And if so, what were those things?
That if you're a white person, all you have to do is complain about how you're being discriminated against. And like the media and politicians and like everybody's just gonna like come running to your aid. Like that pattern was just so clear throughout this, but it made me really angry.
One of the things that as an outsider, one of the things that fascinates me about like that idea is the use of the term reverse racism. This is like, if you are giving it a whole nother term, you know in your heart that it's not the same thing. You know what I mean? Like it just, because you don't need another word for a thing that's the same thing, you know? So it's either you know in your heart that it's the same thing, or you feel yourself to be so superior that you could not deign to even be forced to use the same word as the dark masses, right? But like there's something in the use of that term that for years has fascinated me.
And what it speaks to is something else that I felt was repeated in the book was when if you are doing something wrong throughout all of white American history, just accuse somebody else of doing that exact same thing. And that is a way to weasel out of it. And I mean, this is something that I first kind of realized because of Donald J. Trump. It took me a breath to say the whole name. I was like, Donald J. Trump, is that the things that he was doing, he would just say other people are doing those things. So that was something interesting that I saw repeated throughout the book. And it kind of had echoed what had been said previously.
So the term that the term that made me ask this question was urban renewal, because like that is one that where you see like we saw like the you know, where the programs that live under that banner were very destructive to urban places, but like that just the fact that like this thing, urban renewal, sounds a certain way, and then when you look at what it is, it just really makes you ask, urban renewal for whom, right? And I think that it really, to me, it just really reminded me of how important it is to pull the thread on things that are packaged for us, right? Because you know, if you live in a community or a place where or adjacent to near a place that you know, that hasn't been invested in, right? Like renewal sounds like a good thing, right? And then like you're gonna have people who are wanting your votes, wanting to stay in their jobs, like politicking and selling these ideas. And it just really, oh man, like that's the ghost of this book that I think is just going to be like hanging out on my shoulder for a minute. Right. Or even like, I think about, not a lot, but like there have been instances where I have felt very uncomfortable with the way that people who I know casually talk about Detroit, right? Like, oh, it's making a comeback and blah 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 blah. And it's like, well, what are you talking about when you say that, and for whom? And then in some cases, depending on who it is and what they're saying, like I personally feel like a little like, I don't think hurt is the right word, but I'm like, why do you think I'm the appropriate audience for like what you're saying? Like, is it because you're not thinking about it? Is it because like, I just have follow-up questions in that circumstance, but I often have follow-up questions. In this book, actually, there's an experience, I think I talked about in one of these discussions, or long story short, I was on a road trip and I went to a place and I bought a souvenir, and then the high points of it is like this lady who was working at the place engaged me in a conversation where I was like, no, I would not like to be in a conversation that's talking crap about Asian people, because I don't do that. And why, ma'am, did you think that was why did you look around in here and select me as your candidate for this discussion, right?
Mhm.
And I don't know, that's a question that I often have. This book, though, I think had some answers, right? Because, if she feels like what she's saying is just the norm, right? She's not going to think twice about it. She's going to be like, well, of course this person would participate in like normal everyday conversation. And I'm like, like, and I read that as like, if you're saying that about Asian people, I believe that when I leave, you're going to say to the next person, like, I don't know, I can't believe the government probably paid for the car that she drove here or something. You know what I mean? Like, if you engage me in that conversation, I think you're coming for me too, right? And that's where that puzzled me. It's like, well, what is that? Or was it intentional? Was it like, we're in a polite society, I can say this thing to you and there's really no recourse for you, because like, what are you going to do? Get loud in this like historical gift shop? Like, and it just, this thing happened like so many years ago. I think Alex was like, I think it might have been close to 10 years now, but it still occupies headspace. What is so going back to one thing that you were saying, Jacob, when the author was like, oh, we're naming names, the other thing that you did is name behaviors, and it made me this book made me wonder about like where like domestic violence fits into this picture, and that's not what the scope of his book was like, but I feel like that's a person waiting for the next dance, like when he was talking about like how some of these people who did violent things, in addition to like being thieves, because we saw a lot of thievery in this book, there was a fair amount of like women who were like, no, this dude molested me when I was little. No, this dude, he abused me, right? And then like how that also is a thing that gets to, depending on your point of view, of course, gets to just kind of be swept under the rug. And that was thinking about like what that net looks like is interesting to me. I mean, but I'm glad that he made the choice to, because he did talk about like how patriarchy plays in. And I was surprised. I was like, oh, you're going there. Like when he was talking about like, like this idea of like protecting the purity of white women, yet expecting all the other women to just be there for whatever it is that you want. And I don't usually expect to like see that laid out, which is why I can't imagine recommending this book, right? Because like there's so many things that he's like, oh, let's open door number 7 and turn the light on. That I just think that there are a lot of places where many people would just be like, nope.
Yeah, like in chapter 4. Oh,
Please.
Okay. he really explicitly ties together Reagan, Mr. Ronald, tying together patriarchy, whiteness, nationalism, neoliberal policies, like all of this stuff together, and really like packaged it together. Which was one of those moments where I was like, okay, he is going here. Yes, good, because it's like a lot of these things now do seem tied together, and so it was interesting seeing kind of the roots of that, which I hadn't really been aware of because I'm not that old to have been around for Mr. Ronald's. Even though I am aware enough, but I was like, of course, everything, of course. Of course it's Ronald's, Reagan. It's always Reagan. But yeah, I thought that was very interesting that it was kind of an intentional. And again, that's why I hesitate to recommend this book, because it's not just about whiteness. It's also about masculinity and patriarchy and all of these other things that, the Blue Lives Matter crowd is not gonna want to read.
I'm always stricken by the some of the contradictions that float to the surface in some of the stuff, right? So like there's like this idea that like these women have to be protected, but it's like, but if you were as strong as you say that you are, why are your women unprotected, right? Like I don't think that of course I think that like the idea of these damsels who just need to be held up above all else, I think that is not the right, I don't think that like, oh well, if we just fix the way that you're looking at serving your damsels, everything will be fine. But like the contradiction at the bottom of it is always like really interesting to me. And this book made me think about it a little bit, right? Or just and he basically was like, like people don't poke all the way to the end of the issue, right? Because there's a writer that was talking about the idea of the writer was seeing this issue, right? Like these guys feel like like we're a threat to their women, blah, 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 but like didn't pull the thread all of the way, right? Like it was like this idea about like who is sexually available. And it's like, but maybe like, how about we open that door of like the women's humanity all the way, right? And I feel like he pushed that. I think that he acknowledged that, which I think a lot of people kind of stop short of. But I don't know. This made me want to think specifically about like masculinity and how that's a jail that imprisons many people in a lot of ways.
There's one dynamic that I was thinking about. Why is it that my internet goes out every single time I speak? Oh my gosh. Okay.
I want you to work for it.
So, one of the things that reading this book, I was left with a very clear sense of, right, a lot of what he's calling the possessive investment in whiteness is like, there's a way in which certain people view themselves as victims when they are in fact the people with power. And that is an extremely difficult mindset to disabuse people of.
Yes.
And what I was thinking of was that how true that is in domestic violence, that so many times abusers and bullies actually literally believe that they are the victims. And he doesn't go there, but like that parallel was really striking to me. And it's like, how do you, I will say that this book doesn't offer a lot of solutions. But I think that he just kind of leaves us with that, like, how do you convince people who believe that they are the victim, that they're actually the people who have way more access to power, even if they're not at the top of the ladder, that they have access to power that they are like unwilling to claim until they claim it, when they are making, while they are saying that they're the victim.
So there are things in this book, and like that idea is one of them that made me think about the Brittany Cooper book, actually, because Brittany Cooper argues that like the Black Feminist Project is fundamentally just kind of a different thing, right? Because like there isn't the proximity to like, like Black women don't have the proximity to this power that like a Black man might, because he's not, he doesn't have the gender thing going on, or that a white woman might for, the converse reason. And it just, thinking about those elements really made me think about that book in some ways. But then it made me think about so in thinking about that book and thinking about like the idea of the eyes being on a different prize, it made me think about like, okay, but what is the prize that these people's eyes are on, right? And so like if they have less power than, all the people who are like keeping them oppressed, right? By making them believe, that they have to just like focus their ire at everyone who like has less power than them. Like they've got their eye on that prize. They're not even really looking backward, right? And so like that's a thing that's kind of fascinating to me. And then the thing that like this book was so funny because he was like, like you were saying, Marissa, like a lot of things in the book, like you read about or heard about or something, but like when Miss Fisher came up in the book, I was like, oh, we're talking about her, right? And I just was transported to the time when all of this was happening, and just like this desire to want so bad to be like the worst one in the bunch, right? Because it's really what she wanted, right? And that's really like that's really the argument that some people are making, right? They're like, well, that person was worse than me, so I should be there. Like they don't care if they're like the last person. Like if there are 400 people, and then in terms of like accomplishment and achievement and all of that, they do not care if they're number 400, right? Which is fascinating to me. And that's a weird thing. To me, that's a weird thing to want. Like, why do you want to why do you want to be like that last person? Like, what is the value in that? But like, if the value itself is like making sure that none of the dark masses pass you up, then it makes sense, right? Like, I never have been able to like make sense of that. Like, why do you want to be like, I doubt that those people like want to be, and like I'm going to use language that that is not the right language, but it's like a generalization. Like, I don't think these people are fighting to be the dumbest one in the room so that they can learn from everybody else, And like, I don't think that number 400 is the dumbest one in the room, right? Like we are complex people who offer different things and think in different ways and stuff like that. But it just seems like such a bizarre thing to claw for, unless you are clawing for like your supremacy over other people.
What was that Fannie Lou Hamer quote that was like, if we're all in the ditch, you can't get out of the ditch unless I help you? I'm totally butchering this. But does anyone remember? Can somebody?
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. It's like you're standing on me to get out of the ditch, but you can't get out of the ditch unless
I help you.
Yeah, something like that.
Oh, I should have read it first.
That was a good one. She had some good. This book made me want to read more about her because she had. She seems like she would be fun to read about.
and he even, I thought to myself, I'd love to watch a movie about her. And then later on in the book, it says, people who are as complex as Fannie Lou Hamer don't get movies made about them. And I think that's going to get changed in 2021. Because it reminded me of my experience watching Selma, which I thought that Martin Luther King was depicted in a very complex, confusing, anyways, it's a tangent, but yes.
So that part of the book made me think about something, right? Because like the chapter, I think, was that the chapter where he's talking about Lean on Me?
I believe so. It was that chapter, or was the chapter about the blues player?
Okay.
I think it was a Lean on Me chapter.
So
Yeah.
in thinking about the way that the way that things are depicted, right? Where like in some of these stories, like there's the white hero or something like that. Like this book made me also think about, just the way people are depicted in relationship to each other. And, I was reading a lot of people in response to something on Twitter talking about like how if you see like interracial relationships, that they are often portrayed between a white person and a person of color, as if people of color don't have interracial relationships with each other. And this made me think about that, right? Like how certain things are just positioned around whiteness, even if they don't have anything to do with it. And that's what you reminded me of, right? Like when you're thinking about a complex character who's like, look, this is what I'm trying to do, and just like the presence of white people, or like that comparison, or like striving toward like a white ideal or things like that aren't central. How it's like, no one's going to be interested in that story. It's just like, I felt like this book had like a lot of tentacles into things that aren't necessarily covered in the book, and they shouldn't have been, right? Because like this book covered enough. But it made me, he did a good job of like setting things up in a way that made me think about like a bunch of the different ways that it shakes out. So what'd you think about California? I was fascinated by the California chapter, and I thought that it was brilliant. And I thought that it was brilliant that he began the book, and he was like, everybody has a lot to say about Mississippi, but let's go on over to the West Coast. I thought it was super smart, and I was curious. I was just curious about like how you guys thought about that, because he could have taken it anywhere. Mm-hmm. Like I think that one thing that his book successfully suggests, right, is like it doesn't matter. He could have chosen any place to make the same arguments. And in fact, lots of places showed up. I was like, oh look, my hometown Flint showing up in yet another book, which feels super weird, but that's its own thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where it's like I had to like stop and like look at the back of the book and be like, oh, okay, he's professor at the University of California. Like this is in part why he has this focus on California and this expertise on California. But I've never lived like on the West Coast or anywhere west. But I'm from Ohio, and I spent like 12 years in Virginia. And so for me, like this notion that like racism is only something that lives in the South has been so patently false to me. And I think that there are other people who have done a good job of being like, no, like, why don't you look at like, Michigan, or why don't you look at what happened in Chicago or whatever. But I like that he took it to the West Coast, because I have always received this narrative, right, that California is this very liberal, progressive place. And he just like, so, and like, and again, I knew about a lot of like the anti-Asian immigration laws and things like, so it wasn't like all necessarily news to me, but just the way that he laid that out. And he was like, California has like this brutal racial history. And I was like, you know what, you could go into every state and dig out a similarly brutal racial history.
Mhm.
Like especially like when you think about like the coastal elites, right? Like I think that's like one of the ideas that this speaks to, right? Like you think about certain places, or maybe I think about certain places as like are packaged in certain ways. So I think it was super smart to take one of those places and just be like, all right, here we go. Right. And he could have told any number of stories. That's the other thing about even having that idea, right? Like, okay, so he's choosing the state that many people associate with like, big old blue state, right? But then I started reading this and I was like, who knows where this is even going to go, right? Like he could be talking about people who have been there forever being displaced, right? Along racial lines, because he did talk about that, but there are certain other areas of California where that's true. And I just like, as I was reading the chapter, being 100% unsure as to where it was going, I was like, oh, right, because it could go anywhere, right? And so it kind of reframed, it just put into like focus how like anywhere the story could be told. It's funny in a discussion about something or other, there was someone who, like, one of the first ideas that they expressed was like, I'm from California, so our education looked very different. And this discussion reminds me of that, right? So like, even as like which isn't surprising though, like as I take a moment to like pull that thread, right? Because like in the North, you do that too, right? Like you think about like, okay, but like, what are those textbooks looking like in Texas, right? So like you would do that from a Northern perspective. So it then is no surprise that somebody would do that from a Californian perspective. But I thought that was a lot to think about. And then the Katrina chapter, I was just like, oh man, I hate thinking about that whole situation at all. I really do. Like my extended family is from South Louisiana, so like south of New Orleans, right? And so like I don't like to think about Katrina because like thinking about we used to go to Louisiana every year, blah, 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 blah. And then like, so when I think about that particular hurricane, I think about like the place that like literally like took my grandparents' house, lifted it up and put it somewhere else. Right. And then to like think about how people were talking about New Orleans and being like, oh, great, the hurricane just cleaned it up. Right. And so like that feels personal. You know what I mean? It's like, oh, you wish that like my specific like relatives were just washed into the Gulf. Like that's what it feels like to read about that. But then it makes me think about like what it feels like to read about all these other things. Like it feels like these are people's personal stories. Like even if he's talking about like large patterns, right? Like that, like people's personal stories are underneath that. And I was reminded of that. Like sometimes when we read the personal stories that become large, sometimes when I read the personal stories that become like the ones that we know about, they don't feel like personal stories anymore, right? But then, like reading about like how, to skip ahead to when he was talking about the events of Ferguson, like how individual people are being used to subsidize these things that other people believe that these people who are being used are just leeching, right? Like it's just brain breaking. It makes my brain feel like a staticky TV, really. It's just like, I don't know where to look. This is a mess. There's nothing good in here. Can we turn it off? Like that's what it feels like, you know. And then this reminded me of the new Jim Crow, right? In the way that like these prisons are being built and then like those people are being counted as the population despite the fact that like they don't live there at all, and then they're being like, you know, deliberately taken from their communities, put in these places, counted as people to get additional representation for someone. You know, it's like it just felt like the same thing, which it feels super gross, right? And that's like one of the things, you know, like when you have like a government that's supposed to be taking care of stuff so you don't have to think about it, right? This is like one of the functions, right? Like you got a system to think about a thing that you don't have to think of, whether it's a school or whether it's like the road commission or what, or these larger things. But then it means that you don't think about it. You know what I mean? And then that means that like all sorts of things that you don't want to happen can absolutely happen because like the mechanics of everything is like outsourced, right? Just like we don't think about the cheap labor that results in all of the cheap things that we have. We don't think about the fact that like the way that we're organized means that like people are exploited. Jacob, you made a noise. What is the definition of that noise? If I look that noise up in the dictionary, what am I going to see next to it?
I have a million things to say. I don't know how to say them. And I need to release something from my corporeal being. And that is the best way I can come up with it. A frustration that I've had is that sometimes I'm reading these books and I get to a point and that's my reaction. And it makes me want to disengage. And then I continue to engage and it's just like, oh man. I guess this is all to say that sometimes it can all be very overwhelming.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But I'm only giggling because it's the least overwhelming for somebody like me. So then it just puts it into perspective even more. I don't know. I should have just huffed and kept my mouth shut.
You should have just been like, nope, there's no definition.
So that's like, what are you thinking? And I'm like, no.
You just go like this.
You did it, but I felt it too. Yep, that big sigh. I'm just like,
And then the big sigh makes me feel like, well, don't you have anything else than a big sigh, Jacob? But that's another conversation entirely, I think.
I have found the chapters about the chapters that were more about like culture to be very fascinating. Like when I got to that part of the book, I really wanted to like slow down and read that because particularly the Robert Johnson chapter, I that's a chapter where I felt like, well, you know, he's talking about this artist that is that's engaging with this material in a way that can be constructive, right? Like I think that I just found it interesting. I'm always thinking about like what does it mean to consume something, like who owns what, you know, like once, you know, I talk about like your mental library that you're walking around with, but like once it's a part of your mental library, it's not necessarily the thing, it's like what you think of the thing, right? I mean, just that's always true of a piece of work anyway, right? Like what you created and what I read are not the same. But you know, in thinking about what it means to consume something and what it means to identify with something and how to move forward, I thought that was super interesting because I feel like people struggle with that quite a bit. And I think that people have to develop through that too, right? Like if you're discovering something, you're not discovering it, right? Like it's new to you, it's not a discovery, right? But like sometimes we treat things as discoveries. And that those chapters just made my brain like vibrate quite a bit. And I was just curious, you know, because my brain is vibrating. I'm like, you guys, help me with my synthesis. What do you guys think about these chapters?
I felt similarly insofar as that I had a similar reaction to it. To hear like how popular culture romanticizes the Black experience as means for white people to feel better about race in America. I was like, you got me.
Mhm.
And I began to reflect on media that I've consumed that has made me feel that way. And why did I never question it? I think about this movie I used to watch all the time growing up. It's called A Long Way Home. Y'all are getting the tangent of tangents today. And it's Whoopi Goldberg and it's Sissy Spacek, and Whoopi Goldberg is a maid in a Southern house in the 60s. And I walked away from that movie being like, Sissy Spacek's character is so brave for seeing the humanity in Whoopi Goldberg's character. And I thought that like for literal years, this dang movie. And then it wasn't until maybe a year or so ago, or really this past summer, where I had to think about why one of my favorite movies was my favorite movies. And why did I think that, you know, Sissy Spacek, the character who learns to be decent towards Black people, is the hero and not Whoopi Goldberg. It's because I had stepped into the body of Sissy Spacek and I said, this is the way that I think that I treat Black people, and I see racism in America, and this is what I would do if I was in that situation. That is baloney. So I guess the particular parts about culture, how white people consume culture, and the culture we consume in relation to the Black experience, very much held a mirror up to me, and I had to think about myself, my actions, and what I do. And for that, it was a rewarding experience, and I'm glad for it. But boy, it was a punch in the throat. I was like, I was got together like Velcro, as the kids would say.
I have not heard that one, and it just
it's good, isn't it? Ooh, they got me together like Velcro. Yep, that's exactly what it was too.
Thank you for that gift.
Yeah, thank you. I love it.
That chapter, you made me think about something that I thought in passing while I was reading the book. But it made me think about my own relationship to like media, because like there are times where like I might enjoy a song or something like that, and I literally feel like I don't want to learn anything else about this artist because I don't want to find out they hate Black people. And so like I do not like to learn anything about these, because it's like, you know, you don't, because like after you find out the thing, then you don't necessarily, like, it doesn't feel the same anymore, right? And so then it just makes me feel like I like this song right here, right now, and I would like to know nothing else. If you start talking about this person, I'm going to just go somewhere else in my mind, because I would like to live in a world where I get to enjoy something, and like ignorance sometimes feels like the only way, right? Because you know, again, like when you pull the thread, it doesn't take that many threads to find someone like who hates women, or who hates Black people, or hates Black women, or hates people who like believe things that you believe. Like, it's just like, and this reminded me of that, right? Or like even like when we were talking about Eric Clapton and his like feeling like he wanted to like, I don't know, like like when I was reading the Eric chat, I was like, you like, I feel like you want to consume like Robert Johnson in a almost sexual fashion, right? Like in some of the language, I was like, you want to make sweet love to Robert Johnson. That's what you want. And like, and you want to like own him the way that like some men want to own like whoever they like have sex with. But But even that, like that part of the chapter reminded me, I was like, oh yeah, I remember before I knew anything about Eric Clapton, growing up in the Tears in Heaven era and like listening to this like sad song about his loss, and all of that is true. But then like you're like reading that, it's like, oh yeah, but then he said all this like racist stuff too, while he's also like made his career like identifying with this distinctly Black music form that, you know, this where like racism is definitely one of the core ingredients in that stew, right? And so like it's like anxiety, like it's just like, oh, where is this going? I don't want to, like, can we get to the end of this? Because like
Yeah.
I used to like that song. I remember hearing that song in like road trips like to Louisiana, you know, because like you're listening to the radio on the song. Like I can just remember like being in the van that we had at that time, and like that being one of the songs that's on repeat. And then like you learn more about the person, and you're just like,
I totally appreciated the takedown of Eric Clapton personally. I'm someone who has listened to a lot of like 70s music, and I have never been a Clapton fan. And I kind of knew this about him, and I was like, thank you for saying this. But yeah, I really appreciate that he went there in this chapter in particular, because like I think it's very easy to frame racism as contempt, or ignoring people or whatever. And it's like, no, there's actually also this very, very problematic facet of it, which is like this desire and this fetishization and identifying with an experience that's not yours. That is like just as harmful in a lot of ways. Yeah, so it definitely, like I enjoyed the chapters about like the cultural part of it. They just like rounded out the discussion. Like you just don't get that side of the discussion as much.
In the Robert Johnson, in the Robert Johnson that Eric Clapton was in love with wasn't even the real Robert Johnson at all. It was literally a story that he had made up.
well, and so it's also like the same story that always gets made up about, like, I feel like it's the same story that is often made up about Black people, right? Like they're just like magical, and like magically magic happened. And I think that that's one of the things that allows some white people to feel like Black people never earn anything. Like if you think that like Black people just magically, you know, they like, it's like for some people, it's like they think that like either everything was given to you or magic happened and you had the thing, right? And I think that this book reminded me of that, and I think it's super pervasive. I think that we see it all of the time, and I think that we saw even a little of it when we watched the way that the one guy who had, you know, who was able to attain a certain level of education, how his story got like remixed into something that was not true. And I think that that's like part of like the magic. Like, and this book made me think about so many experiences are just like I hear, like this made me think of, for example, and this is like a silly thing to think of, but like books trigger what they trigger. But it made me think of this dance class that I was taking, and I heard these women talking about like how it must have been like my natural ability or something that was allowing me to follow the instructor, you know, like and I remember hearing that and just being like, wow, like that's audible. But I also remember thinking like, or maybe I go home and practice one, and the teacher was a Black guy, and I just remember thinking, or maybe I actually am able to listen to him and I'm not like doing whatever the hell it is you guys are doing right now, because like you guys are back here, he's instructing, I'm trying to receive the instruction, and you're talking about like how I magicked my way into being able to like do the hip movement that he's trying to teach us right now while you're doing something else, right? Or you know, I think I talked about this before, or like in a Spanish class, doing well in Spanish class, and some guy was like, did you grow up I can't remember now the exact thing, but basically the insinuation was like, well, there must be some reason other than like your ability to study that you are doing better in the Spanish class than I am. It's like, well, but like, I watch you pay no attention all the time. And I have a copy of 501 Spanish verbs just like you do. So, and it's even so, just thinking about very minor experiences reminds me of just like how much of the stuff is, or like sometimes, even in like discussions that have to do, particularly in discussions that have to do with anything that has to do with like race or racism, some people, they talk to you as if you went somewhere and got a cartridge downloaded to you, right? It's like, oh my gosh, well, I never was exposed to X. It's like, can you read? Like, should we be talking about a literacy program? Because like, that's, a lot of things that I think come from things that I have read, you know what I mean? A lot of things that, that I think that I know come from knowledge that I have thought to be valuable. And like that construction is problematic. Like, oh, wow, well, I never had the opportunity to know this. Like, ma'am, you have had like a smooth 20 more years of time on earth. Like, maybe I'm not the right audience, right? And it's like, that's what I always, like, a recurring theme today. Like, sometimes I'm like, why do you think I'm the right audience for this? Like, this is something that I think that you should maybe be telling somebody who's going to identify with it. Because like, I don't. And then it's inappropriate to say like, well, ma'am, I can read. Like that's gonna be taken as aggressive where I'm expected to just like silently take this insinuation that like, magic happened and then things were in my brain, or like I'm supposed to sit here and take this insinuation, or like take this I won't say insinuation because I don't think that's what's happening. But like you're saying to me, like essentially, like I never valued any information that has to do with, things that you might experience. Now I'm gonna look into your eyes. It's like, no, ma'am, I would not like it. I would like to. My fantasy is like having a card where it's like, here are my rates. It's like, if you would like to continue this conversation, here are my rates. Because like, it's not people I know that I'm talking about. You know what I'm saying? Like, I feel like people you have a relationship with, like you establish the boundaries of those relationships, right? But it's like other contexts where something can come up. Like if you go, for example, to a public event, right, and make the mistake of making eye contact, that's where this happens. You know what I mean? Like I just want to be clear, like I'm not talking about any people we know. I'm not talking about people that I actually have like relationships with. Like these are things that happen with just like people you don't know. And it's like
waiting in the store, waiting at the grocery line.
Yeah. It's like, no, thank you.
And then do you ever, I just had this thought earlier this week. Like, let's say I have a racist, homophobic, whatever kind of thought I have, some sort of negative thought towards a minority group. And then I spend my whole life never questioning why I have that thought. And I'm like, wouldn't you want to Google, why am I a homophobe? Figure out why. And people don't want to figure out why. And I'm like, well, why do people not want to figure out why? And the answer is, it's all up in this book too, is that why would I? Like, I want to maintain at the top of the pedestal. If I figure out why I hate Black people, that's going to knock me down a couple pedestals.
Right. There's no rewards. Or, I mean, I think there actually are rewards, but like in that system of belief, there are no rewards. And it's like, I'm going to give up so much if I realize that like, oh, actually, maybe I do live in a racist system. Maybe it isn't a meritocracy. Maybe I am privileged and had access to things that other people didn't have access to. It's like they can't perceive like what the reward of that might be.
Well, and like social factors are big too. Like if you know the kind of boundary enforcement, norm enforcement that you've participated in, like you know what that looks like, right? And so like what does it look like to try to volunteer to be on the other side of that, or like to put yourself on the other side of that, right? Because there are a lot of rules. Like to me, like when I read a book like this, it's like, man, whiteness has a lot of rules. Like, and that's how I think about it anyway. It's like, oh yeah, that's this person can't do that because it's against those rules. Because there are like specific, it's like any other culture. Like cultures have rules, right? And one of the rules, one of the rules that I feel like I observe from the outside is like you don't talk about the rules, right? And so like, it's like, oh yeah. There's rule B that nobody's acknowledging, or like, I don't know, like my partner, like somebody, like when he was talking to somebody, like it was like a while ago, like when we first got together, and I love having a name that like you look at it, you're like, that's probably a Black person. I think it's very useful because like I think it filters out a lot of experiences that might not otherwise be filtered out, especially for like somebody with does the kind of work that I do, has the kind of education I have, blah, 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 blah. Like that name is what is like stopping me from having to see what is behind door number 64. And I enjoy not looking behind door number 64. Whatever's behind that door, it can stay back there. It's not my business and I don't want it. But anyway, in the context of that conversation, I think that he had like been on some dates with some other Black lady before we met. And she said to him, like, and I'm going to clean up the language, but basically like you need to stop associating with them. And he was like really shocked. And I was like, I'm not shocked because like, that's one of the rules. Like you are breaking a norm by like, and like you are breaking a norm by like even talking about the fact that like that you're dating this person, right? Like if you're just doing whatever, that's like squarely inside of the norms, right? But like talking about it and like giving me the status of like being a person that you talked about, you broke the rules. She didn't like it. She told you about it. She's trying to bring you back into line. But like you don't see it that way because you're not you're not seeing it that way because like your rules, like as a white man, you get to do whatever you want. And so like you are appalled that somebody would even be trying to assert any kind of rules around what you do, especially this woman, right? Because like how is this woman gonna like tell you what the rule? It's like there's so many rules that are like overlapping in this moment and like you can't see them, or like he's been surprised by like some of the things that he's seen some people that he knows posting blah 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 blah, and I'm like it was like this does not surprise me, and I'm gonna tell you why. Like he was saying something about he was like, I felt like I knew this guy and blah 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 blah, insert like story that's been told many times, right? And then it was like, what does this guy do? What's his job? What's he do? And then he he describes the thing. I was like, he doesn't feel like he has anything else. And so he is going to put a fence around this thing that he has. Like, what else does he have? What else can you name that he has? Like it doesn't, to me, and again, from the outside, that's what it looks like. And this book, and I've thought that for a while, but this book like changed even the way that I think about that, right? Because I'm like, well, this person doesn't have anything else, and in their mind, right? Like they're like, here's this thing that I have as value, and I do not want the blue book value of my whiteness to go down, right? Like the blue book value of my high school education went down, the blue book value of this went down, the blue book value of that. I cannot have like this last thing. The value has got to stay where it is. And was like the end of the road on that thought. But then I'm like, wait a minute. But maybe this person understands, maybe the person understands more than I thought about the value, right? Because like if the blue book value of that whiteness goes down, that might mean more things for the person, because where would somebody else be, right? Like under the same circumstances, where would somebody else be like with the level of employment and with the level of education and stuff like that? And maybe this person actually very acutely understands like the value of the thing that they're trying to protect. Question mark. I mean, that's just, you know, only just digesting this, but it just made me think about that idea a little bit more.
Which is, and then this whole idea of white failure, right? Like me as a white male, let's say that in some way, shape, or form, my life was not going great. And then somebody's going to tell me that I had all these privileges. And even with all these privileges, I still failed. I'm not going to say that white privilege is real, because then that would be me admitting that I am a complete failure on my own merits. And I don't think white men have shown any ability or interest in being able to say, you know, that was wrong. I shouldn't have done it. Or I've learned something now. I'm going to act differently. There's no historical precedence for that for white men. So that chapter as well, echoing a little bit what you've said and adding a little bit more from that chapter, was something that really stuck out to me in the book.
Well, I think that lack of exposure to people different than oneself is a big factor as well. You know, I definitely think that like that's a huge thing, but I think that it's also like easier to stay in that space. Like if you're not exposed to people, if you're not exposed to like real people in any real way, right, who are outside of your racial group, which many people aren't, right? Like people live in segregated communities, go to segregated churches, you know, a lot of times work in like homogenous workplaces and all of that stuff. Because like if you operate in mixed spaces, one thing that you know early is like, you got smart people of every race, you got dumb people of every race. There is a spectrum because you have seen them all. You can name them by name. You can catalog the smart things that they did. You can catalog the dumb things that they did. You can catalog the smart things that they did when they were pretending to be dumb. Like you can catalog all of that, right? Like when you have proximity to people and you know them and you've seen how they operate, right? But like when you're in a situation and you don't have access to any of that, you don't know, you know, and then like everything is like built on a system that like corroborates what you believe. There's not like, you know, you're not getting any evidence to the contrary. And then our system also like does this thing where like you see somebody who is clearly exceptional, and then those people perform like this totally different role, right? It's like, oh, well, like that's this person who, you know, clearly is accomplished and blah, 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 by all objective measures, you know, like that can either prove to you, right, that there's a spectrum of all sorts of things, or you just reject that evidence and say like, oh, well, that's an outlier. Or like, oh, well, to go back to the guy in the book, oh, well, he, you know, he had a nice white person in his life that made that possible for him, right? Like there's like so I think that those two things like create a very strong cocktail, right, that keep people kind of intoxicated in that way.
I think like
yeah, because like if you look at people, you know, confirmation bias is a thing too, but like if you've seen people operate, like sometimes you're just like, that's not going to end well because I can anticipate this and this and this and this, which reminds me of the choice of James Baldwin, right? Because like one of his things that he always says is like, well, like, you know, we have to observe everything about everybody because it is a matter of survival, right? In some ways, right? So like I say that to acknowledge like maybe some of the reasons that like I'm chewing and digesting in the way that I am is because like you just watch people to see where they are, right? Because you have to watch somebody to see where they're coming from in order to know how your transaction with them is going to be, right? So you have to like watch and observe and take in that information. Like if you hang out at the bottom of our caste system, like it's important for you to be able to like look and see where somebody is coming from, you know, because you constantly have to be like friend or foe, friend or foe, friend or foe. And then like it makes your perspective look a little bit different. And like maybe that's the magic thing that people think that you're getting downloaded, but like that is like a skill that you like hone and learn because you have to.
Mhm. Mhm.
You should be able to put it on your resume. Quickly able to identify friend or foe, and I can put this skill to work for your organization, period. That would actually be a funny art project where you like take adaptations that people have had to learn due to different oppressions and then like write them as resumes.
That would be amazing.
That would be very interesting.
Mhm.
Somebody should do that. All right, guys, what are your closing thoughts with that, or instead of that, like what else, what do you want to read next, or what does this make you want to learn more about? Or the question I normally ask, like what were you thinking about? What did you consume in terms of your media diet that was like hanging out in your head as you were trying to make sense of this tome? Either of those I think are suitable wrap-ups.
I had the fortune and misfortune of binging the HBO documentary about Woody Allen. And episode 2, I turned off the TV and I walked out of my house because I thought I was gonna. Anyways, and what learning about that situation and how he maintained a certain level of social power, artistic power, and the things that he did in order to discredit other people who were telling the truth about him reminded me a lot about what's going on in this book. Like, for example, Mia Farrow goes to a therapist and lets them know that her daughter is being sexually abused with no understanding that that person has to report it to the authorities. So it's reported to the authorities, and how does Woody Allen respond? He files a lawsuit saying, I need custody of those children because she's an unfit mother. And what it reminded me of is how white people often say the things that they are, we then reflect onto people of color as means to feel better about ourselves. So that was something that was definitely working in tandem. Like the trauma of watching that documentary definitely showed itself throughout the book. But it's apples and oranges, but they're both fruit. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. I've been doing a lot of light and fun reading lately. So I've not only was I taking a course this winter about like the invention of whiteness and all of that. I've been reading about European history because I'm like wanting to understand what my ancestors actually went through. And so I like read this whole book on the 30 Years' War, which just like, let me tell you guys, it's not good times. It is super not good times. And I think for me, it's just like kind of like, right, this book focuses on like, you know, the past, like mostly like the past like 60 or 70 years. And then like reading about things that happened, you know, 300 years ago, like, and just kind of like bringing them together in my mind and like understanding like kind of like the systems of oppression and pathology that just kind of got like shipped like wholesale from Europe to other places, and like how that they have morphed and changed over time. It's just like, yeah, it's like a lot of information. So I need to like add some like light things into my reading list.
My final thought is to close the loop on something that we've talked about at most of these book discussions, which is, why does this still feel so relevant? We've talked about that at so many of these book discussions. Like the new Jim Crow was like, I think the 10th anniversary. Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria was like the 20th anniversary. It was a big anniversary. This is the 20th anniversary of this book. But I feel like this book gave us the answer. Right in the, I don't know if it was the preface or the intro that they were talking about, like the changing same and how this is a big system and a big structure and time does not heal all wounds. So I feel like this book kind of wrapped up a lot of those tangential thoughts that we've had. Like, why is this book relevant? Why is Selma still so relevant? Why does it feel like it was made yesterday? Like all of those thoughts that we had already kind of been talking about. I feel like this book wrapped it up in a little bow.
Brought it together like Velcro. What is the phrase?
Velcro. I got together like Velcro. Absolutely.
You know what, you guys, and I think you perfectly brought this discussion together like Velcro at the end. Like, how do you say anything after that? After it got gathered.
Not got gathered.
I've been doing a lot of sewing, okay? Like gathers around my mind. All right, guys. Thank you so much for this conversation. This was a read. I mean, I've been saying that for a lot of them, but woo, there was a lot going on in here. So I really appreciate you guys digging in and I think this is funny. Wait a minute. You know, it was a read when your book is all like,
Yep. Yep.